Many of you, as we head into the year 2026, as we wrap up the year 2025, if you're anything like me, you get into kind of a reflective mood a little bit. You look back on the past year, maybe you start to make some plans around what you want the year 2026 to be. And even if you're not the kind that makes very specific resolutions, this is a time in which most of us grow to be a little bit more intentional about how we think about our lives and how we want our lives to turn out. And this is the time where most of us resolve to say, I'm not going to live life by default, I'm going to live life by design. And so inevitably, when you're being more intentional about the ways in which you think about your life, a word that comes up time and time again is the word priorities. As we think about how we want our life to look like, we have to question, right, where our priorities lie, the things that demand our time and attention and are worth kind of giving our life to. This is a word that I've been thinking about a lot the last couple of weeks. And I came across this passage that I've forgotten about for years that I've come back to. It's a book called Essentialism. And there the author gives a brief word study on the origin of the word priority. And the author says the word priority entered into our vocabulary back in the 1400s. As many of you know, the word priority means something like first or prior to everything. And so by definition, when the word entered into our vocabulary again hundreds of years ago, the word was always used in the singular. So every time the word was used, it was used in the singular form. And it makes sense because it was supposed to be the first, prior to everything else. What's interesting is that it wasn't until the 1900s, actually, hundreds of years after the word first began to be used, that people out of necessity over the complication of their lives started to use that word in the plural form, priorities. And today, as we think about our life and the things that are important to us, if you're anything like me, it's impossible to nail something down to the one thing that takes priority over everything else, isn't it? I find that to be true of myself as each and every year that goes by, there are more and more priorities that demand my time, energy, and attention. Things that I'm responsible for, right? Things that demand more and more and more of me. And isn't that the condition of the modern life? Many of us have all of these different priorities, responsibilities that demand more and more of us. And we feel stretched. We feel tired. And for those of us that are in a season of life where all of a sudden you find that you have less and less responsibilities, maybe your children have left the house. Maybe you're at a pretty comfortable place in your career and in your financial life, and you find, wait, all of a sudden, without all of these things that are demanding more and more of me, you feel a little bit empty. You're like, what am I doing with my life? It's almost an existential crisis that is waiting to happen. And the truth of the matter is, all of us, we're kind of living with this background, with the backdrop of all of these priorities that are asking for more and more and more of us. Now, believe it or not, the backdrop of this passage that we're going to be looking at today is very familiar to the modern condition that we live in. So let me give you a brief little context of this passage. This passage comes from the book of Colossians, which was a letter that was written by who we call the Apostle Paul. And this letter was best known to be what we call a circular letter, right? There are certain letters in the New Testament that we find that was written to a very particular local church in a given city. to a very particular group of people. This was one of those letters that was written a little bit more generally to be passed throughout the region that we call Colossae, the city of Colossae and its surrounding region, for all of the churches to share in the reading and learning from this letter. And these letters were usually written to address a development or a popularly held belief that was spread throughout the region at the time. And here's the belief that many of the people around the region of Colossae believed. They believed that when it comes to their life and the world around them, that there were these powerful spirits and a whole host of them that were shaping their lives. So there were these spirits that were working in commerce, that there were these spirits that were shaping the forces of families, that there were these spirits that were shaping religious life throughout the region. And all of these spirits were spirits to be appeased by the people. And that's the belief that many in the region of Colossae adopted at the time. And it's in that backdrop the Apostle Paul comes in, particularly with today's passage, by saying, you may believe there are all these powerful spirits that are shaping your world today, but you need to understand that Jesus Christ reigns supreme over them all. That he is the priority in your world today. He's saying Jesus Christ stands at the center of all reality. And so I want to take a look at this point and what it has to say about our lives that feel so stretched and pulled in so many different directions. And so we're going to walk through this passage today under three headings. Paul talks about the supremacy of Christ in three different ways. First, he talks about the supremacy of Christ first over all creation. Secondly, he talks about the supremacy of Christ over all powers. And lastly, he talks about the supremacy of Christ over all brokenness, over all creation, over all powers, and over all brokenness. And so let's walk through these 3 points. But first, Jesus Christ and his supremacy over all creation is the first thing that Paul addresses here. And it is all throughout the passage, but really concentrated on verses 15 to 18. And here's what Paul is saying. He first starts out by saying, look, God is invisible. He cannot be seen with the naked eye, but he can be seen through the life and ministry and through the words of Jesus Christ. And so right from the get-go, the Apostle Paul says Jesus Christ is God. That is the claim that he makes. And then he makes the case for how that is true. And to make that case, he goes straight to creation. He talks about Jesus Christ being firstborn over all. Now, there's a point of clarification to be made here, because when Paul calls Jesus Christ firstborn over all creation, he's not using that word temporally or sequentially. In other words, he's not saying Jesus Christ was the first created being. Right? That's what our Jehovah's Witness friends and neighbors believe, that Jesus Christ was the first to be created, and then the rest of creation was created. That's not what the Apostle Paul is saying. What he is saying is, when he's using the word firstborn, he's denoting supremacy or preeminence. So Paul is saying Jesus Christ stands above and over all of creation. And it makes sense because right after that he says, all things were created through and for him. If he was just a created being, it would be impossible for Paul to make that claim about Jesus Christ. But here's what else he says, that Jesus Christ doesn't just stand above creation. Paul says Jesus Christ is the personal center of all creation. He says it is in Jesus Christ all things hold together. In other words, he's saying Jesus Christ is the one that gives all of creation its order, coherence, meaning, and purpose. Because without Jesus Christ, the creation will have no center. It cannot hold. Theologian N.T. Wright once put it this way. He says, without him, electrons would not continue to circle nuclei. Gravity would cease to work. The planets would not stay in their orbits. Paul is telling us that every blade of grass, every insect, you and me, we all owe our existence and meaning and purpose to Jesus Christ. That is an astounding claim that Paul is making about a man who once existed and walked on earth. And yet that is the claim that he is making. Now, what does that mean for us today? Paul says all things were created through him and for him. If you were made through Jesus Christ, if you were created for Jesus Christ, here's what this means. That means you have an author to your story, and you have a creator who created you for a very specific purpose, and therefore, he knows exactly what not just the survival, but the flourishing of your life requires. Let me put it this way. My son, Alan, is a huge animal lover, and he's wanted a pet for a very long time. And we're trying to figure out what would be an appropriate pet that requires the least amount of work, okay? And so we said, okay, you can get a lizard. So he decided, okay, I'm going to get a leopard gecko. But before we brought this leopard gecko, his name is Toby, before we brought Toby home, my son did a ton of research. He went on Google, Wikipedia, he bought books, right, to study what a flourishing life for a leopard gecko requires. So he asked us, what is the biggest tank that we can get? And there was a lot of back and forth about the size of the tank. And we landed on a particular size, and having known what kind of size tank he was going to get, then he went on to do tons of research on what an optimum diet for a leopard gecko looks like. And he did research on what an optimal living space for a leopard gecko would require. So he got rocks and logs and all of this to mimic, what its habitat would look like out in the desert. He talked about, he researched the optimal temperature for the leopard gecko. So he got a heating lamp, and he talked about, and he researched about kind of the day cycle of the leopard gecko. So he got a timed lamp that would emit the perfect kind of UV ray onto the leopard gecko that is automatically timed so that it goes on when it's supposed to be up and it goes off when it's supposed to be going to sleep, and all those kinds of things. And by the time we brought Toby home, by the time Toby was put into the tank, he was entering into an environment that was perfectly suited for him. Friends, if you can have a 10-year-old that could go to such lengths to provide a flourishing life for a lizard who has no emotions, who will never appreciate him, who can never love him back, how much more do you think the God of the universe, your creator, the author of your life, how much more would he care for your flourishing? What Christianity reminds us is that you and I, we are not accidents. We are not big lump of cells that learn to evolve over time to adapt to the environment around us for our survival. What Christianity tells us is that you were not an accident. That every twist and turn in your life, God is caught by surprise and has to figure it out to make the best of a broken situation. No, Christianity tells us that you were made in Christ and through Christ and for Christ. You are designed with God knowing exactly what conditions you need for your flourishing. He has prepared everything for you. Here's what this means. It means every bit of suffering that you go through, and I don't say this lightly, this means that every bit of suffering that you go through, every setback that you experience, every heartache that you've experienced does not happen outside of God's control. Now you are free, as God considers himself to be your Father, to go to him with your complaints, to go to him with your anguish and your grief. But his desire as your maker is that you go to him, that you direct your life to him. For he is the one who has made you. He is the one who knows exactly what is needed for your flourishing. And this is a practice for a Christian, is to trust in Jesus Christ. In whatever that is making you anxious, to say this: if God is a God who can hold galaxies together, if he's a God who can keep the very atoms that constitute who I am from flying off into space, if he is able to do that, he can certainly hold my life together. That is what the first point tells us, that Jesus Christ reigns supreme over all creation. But secondly, we see that Jesus Christ reigns supreme over all powers. Now, I want to press this idea a little bit further. This idea of Jesus Christ holding all things together. Now, if you're the kind of person that is a little bit like me, like I love big ideas and 20,000-foot view and theories and all that, and if you're anything like me, you'd be saying, like, that's great. That is cosmic reality. That is awesome. And it's way out there. But here's the truth. For most of us, we don't wake up in the morning concerned that gravity will stop working. We don't wake up in the morning wondering if nature will be as it is. That is not our concern. Like, what occupies our mind space? What concerns us? What keeps us from being able to sleep at night? The board meetings that we need to have where things are precarious within the leadership. We are concerned about where the market is going and with all the uncertainty. Maybe you're a leader of an organization and you're thinking about Monday and you're thinking about the organizational culture that you're supposed to turn around as a leader, but you can't quite wrap your mind around how to do that, and it feels so out of your hands. These are things that you are responsible for, and maybe some of you, it's a little bit closer to home. There are people that you're responsible for, people that depend on you. Maybe your marriage is running on fumes and you're not sure if it's going to survive. Maybe you have children that are struggling, or maybe you have aging parents that depend on you and you're having a hard time managing it all. You feel stretched. It's one thing to know maybe that Jesus holds my life together. But maybe some of you are asking, like, but what about when it feels like you need to hold everybody else's life together with all my responsibilities? Maybe saying, you know what, like, this is, okay, the realm of religion and the inspiration that I get from it is like sufficient for me to be inspired in my personal life. But what about when I set foot into work? What about when I go back to the home and all of these people depend on me? And I'm just trying to hold everything together. Like, what about that? What about when it feels like you need to hold everything else together? And this is where we need what is said in verse 16 to hit home for us. Paul, after talking about all things being created through and for Jesus, he talks about this. He says, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. And then listen to what he says, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All these things were created through him and for him. Now, if you're to look at the commentaries, there's considerable discussion whether these dominions, rulers, authorities are spiritual beings, and we can have a lot more to talk about that, or human beings or earthly institutions. But if I were to kind of take all of that as a whole and sum it up, I would say Paul here is addressing systems and forces and powers that move the world. Here is taking on the popular belief in Colossae directly. See, for the people in Colossians, it wasn't just a matter of choosing to believe in Zeus or Jesus, where Paul would say, no, don't go with Zeus, go with Jesus, where there was clean break from one religion to another. In fact, for Colossians, Jesus was just fine. It was inspiring to a lot of people to know that Jesus died to forgive them of their sins, and they considered that to be a precious truth. And they would say, that's great. But they would then say, but the universe is filled with all these other powers. And they believed that every single event, mostly tragic ones, like illnesses, plagues, and financial misfortunes, and natural disaster, all those things could be attributed in some way to an unseen power that held sway over that arena of life. And so they saw all of life as all of these powers and beings that were at play that had to be managed well to navigate their way through life well. And so that meant if you were a person that had some responsibility in this world, you had to be vigilant. The more complicated that your life was, you had to be vigilant in keeping up with all of these spiritual practices. You had to go to one medium after another to be on top of what was happening in the realm of spiritual powers. And friends, let me just tell you that that is exactly what is happening in our day. Do you know that, especially among the younger generation, that interest in Christianity has been on the rise? And a lot of Christian leaders rejoice at that reality, not realizing that there's another part of that study that says, so is interest in every other form of religion and spirituality. They're all going up. And what we are finding, especially within the younger generation, is that spiritual practices that were seen as kind of being on the fringes of mainstream culture, like tarot card readings and Ouija boards and those kinds of things, are now inching closer and closer towards the mainstream. And what we are finding is that a lot of them are being carried along towards the mainstream by people who profess to be Christians, young ones. Now, some of you may be all alarmist about this, but I'll tell you this makes perfect sense if you're to see it through the eyes of a spiritually curious young person, because they're seeing out there a world that is fractured, divided, hateful, and confused and chaotic. And so no wonder they've adopted all of these practices. They're adapting to manage all these parts of their lives that feel so chaotic and out of control. And lest you, especially for us older folks, lest you look down on such practices as being incoherent, let me say, for you and me, we may not be involved in all these alternate spiritualities, but we do exactly the same thing if we're being honest with ourselves. See, we give life-shaping power and authority to all of these other things that may not be spirits, but forces nonetheless. Some of us live out of the expectations that have been placed onto us by our parents decades ago, and we are still living under its shadow. We've given life-shaping authority and power to that relationship. Some of us are driven by the forces of what the world talks about in terms of our career checkpoints. And that drives you. Like, this is where I should be in my life. And it drives you. And you've granted it authority over your life. Others of you have done that with financial security. If my bank account reaches this much, I think I'll be okay and it'll give me security. And that's what drives you. You've granted it life-shaping authority to that particular force. So we give all of these things the same governing power the Colossians gave to spiritual forces. See, we may not practice divination, we may not do tarot card readings or whatever, but you know what we try to do? We try to master systems that we cannot control. This is where so much of our expertise culture comes in, right? We check metrics, we check polls, and we check forecasts. We anxiously try to predict and manage forces that are bigger than us. Are we not the same? But Jesus Christ, let's say all these powers and authorities that dictate your life, Paul says Jesus Christ made every single one of them. Here's what he's saying. Jesus Christ is not just more powerful than these forces. Like, these other forces are not rival powers. They are subservient to, submissive to Jesus Christ, who rules over them all. So Paul would say, these are created things that do not need to be appeased. These things do not need to rule your life because they belong to Jesus Christ. Here's what this is telling us. Listen, Christianity tells us that you are never powerless against these forces that are looking to claim your life. You are not an individual that is adrift on sea, being tossed back and forth at the mercy of forces that are bigger than you. Saying you have an anchor in your life, and He is the priority. And He is the one who holds your life together. You don't have to master what He already rules, and you don't have to control what He already holds. You can rest. That means every time you go into a meeting that you're dreading, you remember who the ruler is. When you're faced with uncertainty in your job, you remind yourself who the ruler is, who reigns supreme. When you feel powerless, you understand that you are held by the one who reigns supreme. Because Jesus Christ reigns supreme over all powers. But lastly, Jesus Christ also reigns supreme over all brokenness. And here's what's interesting about this passage to me. See, if Paul wanted to be inoffensive to the culture, he could have just said, God reigns supreme. Right? If you were to just kind of use the generic term God, no one would have batted an eye. They would say, wow, that is inspiring, and that's a very good thing that you're saying, and you're true perhaps. But Paul points to Jesus Christ specifically and says, this man, this God-man, who once walked on earth, who was the carpenter's son, who led this rebellion that seemed to die at the hands of the powers that be, and he was crucified on the cross. This man is at the center of all creation, center of all reality. Now, why does Paul go through great lengths to specifically point to Jesus Christ as the one who reigns supreme over all things? Now, not just because it's true, but he's doing that to make a point. Look at verse 19 to 20. It says, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Now, Paul is saying that the shedding, there's something about the shedding of blood that is crucial to this point. And here's what Paul is saying. Jesus Christ shedding his blood on the cross was accomplishing something. And here's what he was accomplishing. Notice Paul doesn't say Christ is reconciling some things. Nor does he say Christ is reconciling all people even. No, he says Christ is reconciling all things. Here's what Jesus' shedding on the blood on the cross has accomplished. That everything that is fractured and broken by sin, by virtue of Jesus shedding his blood on the cross, is being made whole. All things that are strained, all relationships, whether it's relationship between God and humanity, or even within humanity, or even between humanity and creation itself, all of that is being reconciled because Jesus shed his blood on the cross. And here's why it's so important. It says Jesus Christ shed his blood on the cross, past tense. And because of that, the passage tells us he is reconciling all things, present tense, and it continues into the future. Here's what's happening. Paul is saying peace has been made, that is finished in the past. All work has been done. But this peace is still being enforced and applied to a resistant creation. He's saying the decisive battle has been won, but the skirmishes continue. And he's saying you live in between Christ's finished work and its full manifestation, what we call between the first and the second advent. Now, here's what this tells us. Here's the reason why you feel pulled in so many different directions, even if you have given your life to trusting in Jesus and following him, because you and I live in a fallen world. We live in a broken world. But here's what it tells us. The fact that his work of reconciliation continues in the present into the future. Here's what the Christian worldview tells us. That ultimately, at the end of the day, our world and your life along with it is not spiraling out of control. God, I wish many of you would stop listening to what the algorithm tells you. Contrary to popular belief, the world is not spiraling out of control. The world has been claimed by Jesus Christ as his own and is being reconciled and rescued. And here's one of the hardest, but I think most important lessons for a Christian to learn. That the burden of holding everything together, whether it's the dysfunction of your family background that continues to haunt you, or the brokenness of your world around you, or the chaos that often marks your life, all of that burden was never meant to rest ultimately on you. Because you live and move and have your being in a world that has been claimed by Jesus Christ. Abraham Kuyper, who's a Dutch theologian and politician, once said this. Said, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ does not cry, mine. That means the broken marriage that you're trying to cobble together. Jesus Christ says, that is mine. The fractured family, Jesus says, that is mine. A chaotic workplace that you're trying to manage, Jesus Christ says, that is mine. The disordered world that so often feels like it's hurtling towards absolute chaos. Jesus Christ that says that world is mine. Not yours to fix, he says. but mine to reconcile. See, what do you do when the weight of your burden to hold everything together feels overwhelming? What this passage tells us is you lay it down. Jesus Christ reigns supreme. Jesus Christ stands at the center of all reality. He made all things. He sustains all things. He rules all things. And through his blood on the cross, he is reconciling all things. Friends, would you submit to this Jesus alone? Would you worship this Jesus alone? Would you make him your sole priority? For he is the God who has come to heal and save. Would you worship Christ the King? Let's pray.